It was the summer of 1944, a month after the D-Day invasion, and the war was taking an unexpected turn. The sounds of the front lines had shifted westward, towards the vast fields of Normandy, where the Allies, having broken through German defenses, began their steady march towards victory. On the other side of the war, far removed from the battlegrounds, German soldiers were starting to realize their fate as the Allies closed in. In the midst of the chaos and confusion, a group of German prisoners of war, their faces gaunt from hunger and fatigue, were escorted to a U.S. Army prisoner transport truck. Their eyes, hollow and wary, reflected the grimness of months spent on the front lines, enduring the constant shelling, hunger, and brutality of the war. The journey took them across the fields and into the heart of the American lines, where they were to be taken to a POW camp. As the truck rumbled along the gravel roads, the prisoners exchanged confused glances. They had heard rumors from other captives about what awaited them in American hands, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality. Arriving at the camp, they were immediately met with the sight of organized tents and rows of barbed wire. The air thick with the scent of food, a sharp contrast to the stench of death and disease they had grown used to. As they were ushered inside, they couldn't believe their eyes. Rows of U.S. soldiers were enjoying a meal together, laughing, and eating with a sense of calm and ease they hadn't known in years. The first shock came when the American officers led the prisoners to their own ration line. The German soldiers had braced themselves for the meager portions they were used to in their own camps. A piece of stale bread, a thin slice of rotten meat, and a cup of water were the typical fare they had grown accustomed to. But today, something was different. "Is this for us?" whispered one of the German soldiers, his voice low and cautious. He had just been handed a plastic tray, its contents nearly unimaginable. A steaming portion of mashed potatoes, a thick slice of roast beef, and a side of vegetables. And beside the tray, to his disbelief, was a carton of fresh milk, an item so rare it might as well have been a luxury. They stood in stunned silence, not daring to touch the food at first, unsure if this was some kind of cruel joke or a mistake. But the American guards, not noticing their hesitation, moved them along, pointing to a nearby bench. Slowly, warily, the prisoners took their seats, still unsure of what to do. One of the younger German soldiers, Heinrich, couldn't take his eyes off the food. The mashed potatoes, creamy and white, the beef, glistening in its gravy. His stomach growled loudly, a sound he hadn't heard in months, a sound that made the others around him shift uncomfortably. The days of meager rations had taken their toll, and this feast, though modest by American standards, seemed like a banquet to the starved men. "Go ahead," one of the U.S. guards encouraged with a nod. "Eat, you're safe here." Reluctantly, Heinrich picked up his fork. He was still unsure if this was some form of psychological warfare, a tactic to confuse or weaken them. But as the first bite hit his mouth, he could hardly believe it. The meat was tender, the potatoes creamy, and the milk so cold and fresh. It was like something from a dream. As he ate, Heinrich could see the other soldiers doing the same, their wariness dissolving with each bite. They had never tasted anything like this in their time as soldiers. It felt like betrayal. Their own country had kept them in squalid conditions while the enemy treated them like guests. For the first time in a long while, the prisoners relaxed. There was no fear in the air, no immediate threat. Instead, a confusing mix of gratitude and shame began to settle in their hearts. How could the Americans, whom they had been taught to hate, be so kind? It wasn't just the food that amazed them. The Geneva Convention, the very document they had heard of but never truly understood, was suddenly made real. The soldiers knew the Americans were bound by it, but they hadn't imagined it would be carried out so strictly and so generously. The experience was surreal. Here, on American soil, in the midst of their capture, they were treated not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. This was the bitter irony of their situation. They had expected cruelty and received kindness. The prisoners, though still hesitant, continued to eat in silence. Their eyes darted around, taking in the strange, almost surreal scene. This was nothing like the squalid camps they had come from, where prisoners were treated as expendable and food was scarce. The Americans, who had been fighting them for years, were now offering a level of comfort they could hardly comprehend. As they ate, the reality of their situation began to sink in. For weeks, they had been subjected to hunger and deprivation. The German army had been stretched thin, their supplies running low as the Allies pushed deeper into Europe. Food had been rationed, often barely enough to keep them alive. And now, here they were, receiving a meal fit for a king. It felt wrong, as if they were being given a taste of something they didn't deserve. Heinrich, who had been one of the first to take a bite, sat back and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He was a young man, barely 20, but the war had aged him. His once vibrant face now bore the marks of fatigue, the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that were common among soldiers who had lived through the horrors of the Eastern Front. Yet now, with his stomach filled for the first time in months, he found himself feeling conflicted. He had been a soldier of the Reich, a proud member of the Wehrmacht, but in this moment he felt small, insignificant. "Do you think it's a trick?" one of the other prisoners asked, his voice hoarse. It was a common question, one that had passed through the minds of every man in the camp. Could this all be part of some twisted game, some form of psychological warfare to break their spirits? Was the food meant to lull them into a sense of security before the real cruelty began? Heinrich shook his head, still chewing his food, though it felt like lead in his mouth. "I don't think so. They wouldn't feed us like this if they were planning to kill us. They could have done that by now." The man across from him, an older soldier named Otto, raised an eyebrow. "And you trust them?" "I don't know what to think," Heinrich admitted, looking down at his tray. "But this doesn't feel like the enemy. It feels like we've been treated better here than we were back home. The rations we got in Germany, we would have fought for this. Even our officers didn't get this kind of meal." Otto fell silent, his eyes narrowing as he processed Heinrich's words. The older man had been a soldier for longer, and his skepticism ran deep. He had seen enough to know that in war, nothing was ever as it seemed. But even he couldn't deny the fact that the food, the comforts, and the treatment were unlike anything they had experienced before. For a moment, the prisoners ate without speaking, the sounds of clinking forks and knives filling the air. The silence that fell between them was heavy with confusion. This, they realized, wasn't just about food. It was about the reality of their situation, their sudden, humbling fall from being proud soldiers to being cared for by the very enemy they had fought so ruthlessly against. In the distance, a truck rumbled by, carrying supplies for the camp. The sound reminded Heinrich of the trucks back home, the ones carrying supplies to the front lines, the ones that never seemed to be enough. They had never seen this kind of abundance before, and it was hard to reconcile it with the brutal war they had been part of. The guards, noticing the prisoners' growing unease, walked past with casual indifference. They didn't seem to take much notice of the prisoners' reactions. To them, this was simply part of the process, feeding the captives, keeping them comfortable for the time being, and preparing for the next phase of the war. But for the German soldiers, it was a moment of reckoning. The prisoners were being shown a stark contrast to the world they had known, a world where suffering, sacrifice, and duty had been the orders of the day. Here, in the hands of their captors, they were learning that their enemies were not the faceless monsters they had been told about. They were human, too. Heinrich looked around, his gaze lingering on the faces of his fellow prisoners. They all seemed lost in thought, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. They had been taught to hate the Americans, to believe they were ruthless and devoid of compassion, and yet, in this moment, they were being shown the opposite. "Do you think they're trying to break us?" Otto asked, his voice quieter now. "Trying to show us that we're nothing?" Heinrich looked up at the American guards, who were standing a short distance away, talking amongst themselves. He studied their faces, their calm demeanor. He realized then that they didn't see the prisoners as broken men, but as soldiers, men who had fought on the other side, but who had also been caught up in the same war. "I think they're just feeding us," Heinrich said softly. "Feeding us like we're still human." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The enormity of the situation, the kindness they were receiving in the face of their enemy's victory, left them in stunned silence. As the days passed, the German prisoners began to settle into their new reality. The initial shock of the food and the kindness shown by their American captors started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and, at times, guilt. The rations, initially met with disbelief, now became a daily routine. Fresh fruit, ice cream, milk, and even soda were served regularly. It was an experience that seemed to defy all logic for these soldiers, who had lived through years of austerity in German prison camps. Heinrich, still reeling from the disparity between the harsh conditions they had left behind and the comfort they were now receiving, couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had once been part of the machine that had crushed so many others, from the bombing of civilian targets to the brutal sieges on the Eastern Front. Yet here he was, sitting at a wooden table, a plate of food in front of him, offered by the very people he had once been taught to despise. His thoughts were interrupted when an American guard, a young man no older than himself, approached their table with a large pot of coffee. He filled each cup with care, offering the hot drink to each prisoner, his movements as casual as if they were old friends, not captives and captors. As Heinrich accepted the coffee, he was struck by the absurdity of it all. The young guard, smiling and chatting with the prisoners, seemed utterly unbothered by the fact that these men had been his enemies only days before. The moment felt almost surreal, and Heinrich found himself in an internal struggle. Could he continue to view the Americans as enemies after everything he had experienced here? Or, more importantly, could he even trust his own perception of what was happening? The German soldier had been taught, from the moment he was old enough to understand the world, that the enemy was monstrous. But this was something entirely different. The kindness he was shown seemed to chip away at the foundations of everything he had believed in. As he sipped his coffee, Heinrich couldn't help but observe the other men around him. The older soldiers, like Otto, had their guards up. They were seasoned veterans who had seen far more of war's true nature than Heinrich could ever imagine. Otto had been one of the first to voice his skepticism about the Americans, questioning their motives. "You don't think they're doing this to lull us into a sense of security before something worse happens?" he had said days earlier. But even Otto was starting to relax, slowly allowing himself to believe in the possibility that this generosity was genuine. Then, one afternoon, the impossible happened. The American guards invited the prisoners to watch a movie. The screen was set up in a small recreation tent, and as the soldiers gathered to take their seats, they were handed popcorn, a treat so rare it almost felt like a fantasy. The film was in English, and none of the prisoners understood the words, but the images on the screen were enough. It was a war film, one of the many American propaganda pieces that glorified their nation's might. For a brief moment, Heinrich felt like an outsider in this strange, new world, but he couldn't deny the feeling of comfort that spread across his chest. The simple act of watching a film, something that had been part of his civilian life before the war, was suddenly an emotional release. As the film played, Heinrich's mind wandered back to his family in Germany. His parents, who had been so proud of him when he enlisted, had never known what he had truly seen. What would they say when they heard about his treatment here? Could he ever reconcile this experience with the propaganda he had grown up with? The film ended, and the prisoners were slowly escorted back to their barracks. The air was thick with unspoken words, and no one was quite sure how to process what had just transpired. As they walked back, they passed a group of American soldiers laughing and talking among themselves, some still holding their popcorn bags. A quiet realization settled on Heinrich's shoulders. The Americans, so kind and seemingly untouched by the weight of the war, were not what he had expected. They were not the monsters he had been taught to fear. Instead, they were human, just as he was. They too had families. They too had lives beyond the battlefield. When they returned to their barracks that night, the prisoners found their minds racing. Heinrich lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He had once believed that the enemy was faceless, an abstract concept that could be hated without consequence. But now, in the quiet of the American prison camp, he had seen the truth. The line between enemy and ally was not so clear-cut. The war was more than just a battle of armies. It was a battle of ideals, of humanity, of survival. The next morning, the men were served another hearty breakfast. But today, something had shifted. The men ate without the hesitation that had marked their initial arrival. There was still uncertainty in their eyes, but now it was mixed with something else, an understanding. This camp, these men, the food, the kindness, it wasn't part of the war they had been raised to fight. It was part of the reality they were living in now, a reality that had shaken their very perception of what war was truly about. The food was still abundant, still generous, and though they hadn't fully processed the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on them, they realized that the Americans had given them more than just food. They had given them something far more valuable, a glimpse of humanity in a world that had been devoid of it for far too long. The days stretched on in the camp, each one blending into the next. The prisoners fell into a rhythm of life they had never expected. Despite being on the losing side of the war, despite being surrounded by the victorious Americans, they found themselves experiencing a comfort they hadn't known in years. The food kept coming, the rations more abundant than they had ever imagined. Fresh bread, meat, and even desserts that most had only heard about in stories. For a while, the prisoners allowed themselves to indulge in these small comforts. The guilt they felt overshadowed by the physical relief of their hunger. But it wasn't long before something inside Heinrich began to shift again. Though the kindness shown to him and his fellow soldiers was undeniable, something deeper gnawed at him. How could he reconcile the generosity they had been given with the role he had played in the destruction of so many lives? The food, the drinks, the entertainment, it all felt like a dream he didn't deserve. Was this kindness a form of mockery? Or perhaps the Americans were simply trying to break them down psychologically, to make them feel weak, to strip them of their identity as soldiers and men. One evening, as Heinrich sat outside the barracks, watching the sun set over the horizon, the reality of the situation weighed on him heavily. The distant rumble of trucks and the occasional voice of a passing guard reached his ears, but it was the silence within himself that troubled him most. In that moment, he was reminded of something he had learned back in Germany. The soldiers, his brothers in arms, were always told that the enemy could never be trusted, that every gesture of goodwill could be part of a larger plan to manipulate them. Could the kindness they were shown be part of some larger psychological strategy? Was this all just part of the game? Heinrich found himself asking the same question that had plagued many of his comrades. Why were the Americans treating them like this? His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. Otto, the older soldier who had remained skeptical from the start, walked up to him, a somber look on his face. "You're not the only one thinking it, Heinrich," Otto said quietly, sitting down beside him. This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." Heinrich looked at him, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what to think anymore. It's like they're trying to make us forget what we did, what we've become." Otto sighed, leaning back against the rough wooden post of the barracks. "I don't know if it's a trick or if they're actually trying to help. All I know is that something feels wrong. No enemy treats you like this." The two soldiers sat in silence, their minds swirling with unanswered questions. They were not the only ones who had begun to feel this growing unease. As more and more prisoners wrestled with the same doubts, the camp became a place of quiet contemplation. The initial gratitude for the food and the safety of the camp had worn off, replaced by an unspoken discomfort. Meanwhile, the American soldiers seemed to go about their business with casual ease, never once expressing any hint of malice. The disparity between the treatment of prisoners in Germany and what they were now experiencing in this American camp was striking. To some of the German soldiers, the kindness felt almost foreign, like a kindness they did not deserve. And yet, it was real. One night, as the prisoners gathered around a campfire to share stories of their past, a young American guard approached, carrying an old guitar. He strummed a few chords before offering it to one of the prisoners. The man, a musician before the war, took the guitar and began to play. The haunting melody drifted into the night air, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the war had never happened. It was as if time had slowed, the prisoners and the guards sharing something intimate, something that transcended the violence and hatred that had consumed both sides for so long. But even as the music played, Heinrich's doubts continued to simmer. He couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The men around him had been part of a brutal regime, one that had committed atrocities across Europe. And now, here they were, sitting around a fire, treated with more humanity than they had ever shown anyone else. It was a paradox that made his mind spin. Was this the end of their punishment, or was it something else? Could this be the beginning of a new kind of suffering, a psychological torment that would stay with them long after the war was over? The guitar stopped playing, and the fire crackled, breaking the heavy silence. The men began to slowly disperse, each retreating to his own thoughts. But Heinrich remained by the fire for a while longer, staring into the flames. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Didn't know how to reconcile the kindness of his captors with the cruelty he had witnessed on the battlefield. As he stood up and walked back toward the barracks, he realized something profound. The war had not only shattered his world, it had shattered the way he understood humanity. The lines between right and wrong, enemy and ally, had become blurred. In the midst of his confusion, one thing became clear. He would never look at war the same way again. The following morning, the routine resumed. The prisoners filed into the mess hall for breakfast, where more food awaited them. But for the first time, Heinrich did not feel hunger, only a gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with the stomach. The war had broken something inside him, something that no amount of food or kindness could ever heal. Weeks had passed since Heinrich and his comrades arrived at the American POW camp, and the strain of their confusion began to take its toll. The kindness of their captors, the bountiful meals, the freedom of movement within the camp, it was all starting to feel like a double-edged sword. While their bodies had been nourished, their minds remained trapped in a paradox that couldn't be easily escaped. The Americans, by all outward appearances, seemed to have no ulterior motive in their treatment of the prisoners. Guards were friendly and cordial, the food plentiful, and the atmosphere far removed from the brutality of their own camps. But Heinrich couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, studied like lab rats in a cage. The kindness felt too foreign, too out of place. One cold morning, the prisoners were gathered in the camp yard for a roll call, the early mist still hanging heavy in the air. The guards were positioned at their posts, some chatting with the prisoners as they lined up, others more aloof, watching from a distance. It was during this routine that a sudden shift occurred, one that would forever change the way Heinrich viewed the situation. An American officer, Major Thompson, stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He was a tall man, with a weathered face that spoke of years in the service. He gave the prisoners a curt nod before addressing them. "We're making some changes to the camp today," he said, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "You'll be helping us with some construction work around the camp. We need to build a new latrine, and we need all hands on deck." Heinrich glanced around at his fellow prisoners, some of whom looked uneasy at the idea of labor. They had been given minimal tasks before, but nothing like this. Their first instinct was to refuse, but there was something about the way the officer spoke so casual, so matter-of-fact that made them hesitate. They had been fed, housed, and treated with respect. Would they really refuse to do this work, knowing the alternatives? Heinrich felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The war had taken so much from him, from all of them. But this was different. It wasn't a question of survival anymore. It was a question of their dignity. They had been reduced to something they could not ignore, something that threatened to strip them of everything they had left. As they were escorted to the worksite, the prisoners fell into a quiet line, walking in a daze. They were used to harsh labor, used to digging trenches and lifting heavy loads under the watchful eyes of their own officers. But this felt different. The guards weren't standing over them with rifles, ready to strike at the slightest sign of disobedience. Instead, the American soldiers were standing to the side, watching them work. They offered a few words of encouragement here and there, but no one raised a hand to force the prisoners into labor. The sight of it was enough to confuse Heinrich even further. He felt trapped, caught between the kindness of the Americans and the lingering guilt of his own actions. For the first time since his capture, he found himself questioning what had been drilled into his mind for so long. Was this really the enemy? Were these men the villains of the story? Or was it all part of the propaganda that had shaped his worldview for so many years? He continued to dig, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't put into words. The other prisoners worked quietly beside him, each absorbed in their task. But it was clear that they too were struggling. There was something fundamentally disturbing about this experience, something that neither food nor work could erase. As the day wore on and the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Major Thompson approached Heinrich. He paused for a moment, watching the young German soldier with an inscrutable expression before speaking. "You're doing good work," the officer said, his tone unexpectedly soft. "I know this isn't what you expected, but we're not here to break you. We're here to make sure you get through this, to help you get home eventually." Heinrich froze. The officer's words struck him like a blow, though it was not harsh or cruel. There was no mockery in the tone, no superiority. The words were simple, sincere, and they didn't fit into the narrative Heinrich had grown up believing. "You think we're the good guys?" Heinrich asked, his voice rough. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. "I think we're doing what's right. Not every soldier gets to choose the side they fight for, but they can choose how they behave when the battle's over." Heinrich stood still for a long moment, the weight of the officer's words sinking in. How many times had he heard the opposite? How many times had his officers, his comrades, spoken of the Americans as if they were beneath contempt? And now, here he was, standing on a battlefield of a different kind, one where right and wrong weren't so easily divided. As the prisoners filed back to their barracks that evening, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted. The work was grueling, but it was the conversation with the officer that had struck the deepest chord within Heinrich's heart. Could it be that, after all this time, he had been wrong? That his entire understanding of the war, of what it meant to be a soldier, had been built on lies? That night, Heinrich lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, wrestling with these new thoughts. The war had been a war of ideologies, a clash of nations. But in this camp, it seemed the greatest battle was one of the mind. And for the first time, Heinrich wasn't sure where he stood. The days following their work assignment passed in a blur. The once clear lines between captor and captive, enemy and ally, began to fade with each passing hour. The kindness of the American soldiers, which had initially felt like a tactical ploy, had begun to weigh more heavily on Heinrich's conscience. The more he thought about it, the more the questions kept coming. Why? Why were they being treated like this? Was it some form of propaganda? A psychological experiment? Or was it something simpler, something more profound, a gesture of humanity amidst the chaos of war? The prisoners' daily routines resumed, but Heinrich found it increasingly difficult to shake the thoughts that had been gnawing at him. He'd been raised in a world where enemies were faceless, dehumanized, part of the propaganda machine that painted the Allies as monsters to be vanquished. But here, in this camp, the Americans were showing him something completely different. They weren't monsters. They weren't even adversaries anymore. They were human beings, as flawed and as real as anyone he had ever known. One afternoon, Heinrich sat alone outside the barracks, his back against the cold wooden wall. The sounds of the camp surrounded him, but his mind was far away. He could still feel the sting of the officer's words echoing in his mind. "We're here to make sure you get through this." Those words had struck him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the notion of survival, it was the idea of redemption, of being treated as something more than just a soldier, more than just a cog in the machine of war. He had seen the horror of war up close, the screams of civilians, the devastation of bombed cities, the broken bodies of comrades on the battlefield. But what about this side of the war? What did it mean when the enemy showed mercy, showed compassion? What did that say about the world they were fighting for, and the one they had lost? The questions were too much to bear alone. Heinrich decided to seek out Otto, the one man in the camp who had consistently voiced his suspicions. The older soldier had been cynical from the start, resistant to believing that the Americans could be anything but manipulative. But Heinrich had begun to doubt whether Otto's view was entirely right. Maybe, just maybe, there was a part of this situation that Otto couldn't see, a part of the world that Otto had never allowed himself to consider. He found Otto near the camp's communal area, sitting by himself on a bench, his eyes lost in the distance. The older soldier's face was worn, his once strong features now etched with fatigue. When he saw Heinrich approach, he waved him over, though his expression remained neutral. "What's on your mind, boy?" Otto asked, his voice thick with the weariness of the war. Heinrich sat down beside him, still feeling the weight of the officer's words. He opened his mouth, but for a long moment, no words came. How could he explain what he was feeling? How could he put into words the confusion, the gnawing sense of doubt that had taken root in his heart? "I don't know, Otto," Heinrich finally said, his voice strained. "I don't know what to think anymore. Everything is wrong. It doesn't feel like war. These men, they're treating us like we're not even their enemies." Otto raised an eyebrow, turning his weathered face towards Heinrich. "What are you trying to say?" "I don't know," Heinrich replied, staring at his hands. "But I can't help but feel that. I'm being shown something I never understood. They're not monsters. They're not our enemies. They're just people. They're just like us." Otto's gaze softened, though his skepticism remained. He had lived through the worst of the war and had seen what men were capable of when pushed to their limits. But Heinrich's words made him pause. He had always seen the Americans as the enemy. But now, in this camp, where the rules of battle no longer applied, the lines had become impossibly blurred. "Don't let them fool you," Otto said quietly. "These men are still the enemy. Don't forget that. Just because they're being kind now doesn't mean they won't turn on us when it suits them. War changes everything, Heinrich. Don't let this soft treatment make you forget who you were before this." Heinrich felt the weight of Otto's words, but they didn't sit well with him. He couldn't deny that part of him understood Otto's caution. There was a part of him that feared the kindness they were receiving was merely part of a bigger scheme, a means of breaking them down. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. These men weren't perfect, but their humanity shone through in a way that defied everything he had been taught to believe. Later that evening, as the prisoners sat down to their evening meal, Heinrich found himself staring at the food in front of him, still wondering why the Americans had chosen this path. He had been prepared to hate them, to see them as the enemy in every way. But here they were, offering more than just sustenance. They were offering a chance for something else. A chance to rebuild, to start again. But could he accept it? Could he accept the reality that perhaps the war was not just about defeating the enemy, but understanding the shared humanity that lay beneath the surface? As the camp settled into the quiet of the evening, Heinrich made a silent vow to himself. He would not forget who he was, or the things he had done. But he would also not let this moment pass him by without understanding it. War had taught him many things, but in this strange, unexpected place, it was teaching him something new. That humanity, kindness, and mercy could be found in the unlikeliest of places, even on the other side of the battlefield. The weeks continued to pass, each one carrying its own unique weight. The prisoners, once skeptical and suspicious, had started to find a rhythm in their daily lives. The food kept coming, the work assignments were manageable, and for the first time in a long while, they had the luxury of not having to worry about survival at every turn. But despite the seemingly peaceful routine, the questions lingered. Could this be real? Could the kindness they were receiving truly be without any strings attached? Heinrich had found some solace in talking with Otto, though their conversations never fully bridged the gap between their different worldviews. Otto had seen too much of war's cruelty to be swayed by kindness. He remained wary, always looking over his shoulder, as if waiting for the inevitable betrayal that would come. Heinrich, on the other hand, found himself conflicted, pulled between the comfort he was receiving and the history that had shaped him. It was during one of these days, as they were assigned to help with repairs around the camp, that Heinrich met someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew about the enemy. His name was Private Harris, a young American soldier assigned to help supervise the prisoners' work detail. At first, Heinrich barely took notice of Harris. The young soldier, barely older than Heinrich himself, was efficient and professional, keeping his distance from the prisoners. He seemed no different from the others, kind but distant, doing his job without question. But as days passed, Heinrich began to notice something strange. Harris wasn't just a guard. There was something else in the way he looked at the prisoners, a flicker of something beyond the typical duty of a soldier. Curiosity, maybe. Or perhaps empathy. One afternoon, as Heinrich worked alone near the camp's edge, fixing a broken fence, Harris approached him. At first, Heinrich tensed, expecting some order or reprimand. But instead, the young soldier simply nodded and leaned against the fence. "You're a good worker," Harris said, his voice casual. "We don't usually see many of you doing the repairs. Most of the time, you're stuck doing the digging." Heinrich glanced up, surprised by the comment. "We're capable of more than just digging," he replied, a hint of pride in his voice. He had been a soldier before all of this, and the work of a farm laborer was not what he had been trained for. But here, it was a new role, one that, oddly, allowed him to feel useful again. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "I've been in your position," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "Not the same, I know, but I get it. I didn't choose this. None of us did." Heinrich stopped what he was doing, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Harris shifted, looking around briefly before leaning closer. "When I enlisted, I thought it was for the right reasons. I wanted to protect my country, fight for my people. But then, after I saw what we were doing to people, what we were fighting for, it all started to feel wrong." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Sometimes I wonder if we're all just pawns, playing roles we don't fully understand." Heinrich's gaze softened. For the first time, he saw in Harris not just an enemy soldier but a fellow human being. Someone who, like him, had been swept into this conflict and had been forced to wear the uniform of a side he hadn't truly chosen. Heinrich had long believed that the Americans were simply invaders, faceless enemies bent on defeating Germany. But now, standing before him, was a man who had doubts, who was questioning the same things Heinrich had begun to question in his own heart. "Do you ever wonder," Heinrich began, unsure if he should even be speaking so freely, "if the war itself is the real enemy?" Harris looked at him, his expression unreadable, but after a long moment, he nodded. "Every day," he said quietly. "I think it's easy to forget who the real enemy is when you're caught up in a fight you didn't start. But in the end, we're all just people, and we all suffer." The words lingered in the air between them, a quiet realization dawning for both men. They had been taught to see the other side as a monolith, as the enemy to be destroyed. But here, in the strange confines of the POW camp, where the lines between right and wrong had blurred, they were starting to understand something different, something more fundamental. They weren't so different after all. Soldiers, men, humans caught in the maelstrom of war, forced to become something they had never been before, something their hearts were not prepared for. As the workday ended and the prisoners returned to their barracks, Heinrich found himself walking beside Harris for the first time. The young American soldier offered a quiet, almost hesitant smile, one that spoke volumes more than words could. For a moment, they both walked in silence, the weight of the war momentarily forgotten. Neither of them knew what would come next. The war was still raging on, still tearing apart families, nations, and lives. But for the first time in a long while, they both had an understanding that transcended the uniforms they wore. And in that brief moment, as two men who had been enemies stood side by side, there was the faintest flicker of hope, the kind of hope that could only exist in the space between the battlefield and the humanity that still remained. The uneasy silence that had settled between Heinrich and Harris lingered long after they had parted ways for the night. Each man returned to his barracks, but neither of them could shake the thoughts that plagued them. For Heinrich, the bond that had started to form with the young American soldier felt like a betrayal to everything he had known. In this war, the enemy wasn't supposed to be someone you could talk to, but as he lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, the idea that soldiers could share more than just the battlefield started to feel undeniable. As the days passed, the uneasy alliance between the prisoners and their captors continued to evolve. The Americans didn't treat the German soldiers like the soulless enemies they had been taught to hate. Instead, they treated them with a measure of dignity and respect. It was a subtle but powerful shift, and as much as Heinrich tried to resist it, he couldn't ignore it. In the mornings, the prisoners gathered for their daily ration of food, the same hearty breakfast they had come to expect, but now with an underlying sense of discomfort. Even the food, so generously offered, felt laced with a bitter truth. Each meal reminded Heinrich of how hollow the war's purpose had become, and how far from the path of righteousness both sides had strayed. It was on one of those mornings that Major Thompson, the officer who had addressed them when they first arrived, called for a meeting. The prisoners were lined up in the center of the camp as the officers stood in front, their expressions unreadable. Heinrich and the others stood still, bracing for some new announcement, perhaps another labor assignment or a change in the routine. But what Thompson said next shook them to the core. "We've been ordered to transfer you to another camp," the major said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of finality to it. "The war isn't over yet, and your fate is still tied to what happens next. We've been ordered to move you deeper into Allied territory for processing. From there, the next phase of the war will decide what happens to each of you." The announcement hung in the air, thick with tension. For a moment, no one spoke. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the words sinking in. Would this move be their end? Were they being relocated for further interrogation? Or were they simply pawns being shifted to another location to wait for the inevitable outcome of the war? Heinrich felt his stomach tighten. The safety of this camp, this strange sanctuary where they had been treated with more kindness than he ever thought possible, was slipping away. Would the next camp be the same? Or would they face a harsher reality once again? As the prisoners were escorted to the trucks, their bags packed and their belongings hastily thrown together, a strange feeling of loss washed over Heinrich. He couldn't explain it, but he felt as though they were being driven out of the only place where they had found any semblance of humanity. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he also knew that their journey was far from over. The convoy of trucks rolled down the dusty road, moving deeper into Allied-held territory. Alongside him, his fellow prisoners were silent, absorbed in their own thoughts. No one spoke, the uncertainty weighing heavily on everyone's minds. For Heinrich, the quietness felt suffocating. It was as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to change. And as they drove farther from the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that the war was about to take a new turn, one that none of them were prepared for. The trucks rumbled over the rough terrain, the sound of tires against gravel filling the air. The further they drove, the more Heinrich felt the loss of the camp and the fragile peace it had provided. The quiet kindness of the Americans seemed like a distant memory, one that he wasn't sure he would ever see again. The landscape outside the truck windows blurred, a symbol of how rapidly the world around him was changing. Suddenly, one of the trucks came to a halt. Heinrich's heart skipped a beat as the prisoners in his truck exchanged nervous glances. The convoy had reached a crossroads, a point where they would be divided. The truck doors opened, and armed guards motioned for the prisoners to disembark. They were being led to a small building off the main road, a place that looked nothing like the relative safety of the camp they had just left behind. Major Thompson stepped forward, his face grim. "This is where we part ways. From here, you'll be sent to different locations for processing." Heinrich's heart sank. He looked around at the men, some of whom he had shared meals with, some of whom he had only just begun to understand. They were about to be torn apart again, just like they had been at the beginning of the war, divided by nationality, by ideology, by the very force that had thrown them into this endless cycle of conflict. As the guards began to separate the men, Heinrich's eyes locked with Otto's. There was no need for words. Both men understood that this was the end of one chapter, but whether it was the end of the war or just another pause in the cycle, neither of them could know. And as they were led into the building, the noise of the world around them fading into the background, Heinrich felt a deep, bitter sorrow well up within him. The kindness he had experienced, the compassion of the American soldiers, it had all felt like a fleeting moment of peace in a war that had stripped away every semblance of humanity. But perhaps, in the quiet moments, they had glimpsed something true, something that could survive, even in the face of overwhelming destruction. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the world outside felt distant, unreachable. Section 9, Asterisk. The final lesson, Asterisk. As the days passed in the new holding area, the mood among the German prisoners grew increasingly tense. The small building they were confined to had no windows, only narrow cracks in the walls through which the prisoners could hear the distant rumble of war still raging. The oppressive quiet inside felt heavier with each passing hour, and for Heinrich, the isolation was almost unbearable. The last time he had been separated from his comrades had been on the battlefield, when the war had pulled them in different directions. Now, as he stood among strangers, his mind kept drifting back to the kindness he had received at the American POW camp. Was it all a fleeting illusion? Or was there truly a possibility that humanity could endure, even amidst such devastation? The guards who stood watch over them in this new camp were different. They were less friendly, less talkative. The warmth of the earlier days had vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of what was still to come. Some of the prisoners had started to whisper about their fate, speculating that they were being moved to a larger processing camp, or that they were simply being prepared for transport to another country, perhaps for labor or imprisonment. The uncertainty gnawed at them, each hour feeling like an eternity as they awaited their next orders. It was during one of these long, uneventful days that Heinrich found himself alone, sitting against the wall of the barracks, his thoughts consuming him. His eyes were fixed on the floor, where a small crack in the stone reflected the light from the dim bulb overhead. The memories of the American camp, the food, the camaraderie, the fleeting sense of safety were slowly fading, but they still lingered in his mind, a reminder of what could have been. He was jolted from his thoughts when a figure approached him. It was Harris, the young American soldier who had, in some way, started this whole internal battle for Heinrich. The soldier stood at a distance, his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform slightly worn from days of travel. He wasn't wearing the hard expression that most of the guards had, but instead, there was something different, a look of weariness, perhaps even guilt. "You all right?" Harris asked, his voice soft but carrying in the quiet of the barracks. Heinrich looked up, surprised to see Harris there. The soldier had always kept his distance before, never venturing into the barracks where the prisoners were held. But now, for the first time, he was standing there, looking almost human. "I'm surviving," Heinrich replied, his voice low. "Just wondering when this will end, when the war will end." Harris nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving Heinrich's face. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I don't think we're meant to fight each other forever, you know. We were all just caught in this mess." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I never thought I'd end up here, like this. I joined up because I thought it was the right thing to do. But now, I'm not so sure." Heinrich regarded him for a moment. The words were simple, but there was truth in them. For the first time, he saw Harris not as an enemy soldier, but as someone who had been caught in the same storm, forced to carry the same burden. The enemy lines had never been so clear before, but now, in this confined space, with nothing but time to think, those lines had become painfully blurry. "You didn't choose this any more than I did," Heinrich said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "We're both just soldiers, and soldiers don't get to choose what happens to them." Harris looked down, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That's what they always tell us. But maybe, in the end, it's not about what we choose. Maybe it's about what we do with what we have left." The two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. For Heinrich, it was a revelation, a realization that, despite everything they had been through, despite the labels they had been given, they were both human. Soldiers, yes, but humans first. The sound of footsteps approached, and Harris straightened, his expression hardening as the guards walked past. He gave Heinrich one last glance before turning to leave. "I guess we'll see each other on the other side," Harris said, his voice barely audible as he disappeared down the corridor. Heinrich remained standing there, the words echoing in his mind. He hadn't known what to expect from Harris, hadn't known what to expect from this entire situation. But in that brief exchange, he had learned something far more important than any lesson taught on the battlefield. It wasn't just about winning or losing the war. It wasn't about the propaganda or the ideals they had been taught to fight for. It was about the moments of human connection, the brief moments of grace that could be found even in the darkest of times. He had shared one such moment with Harris, and though they would never be friends in the conventional sense, Heinrich realized that perhaps there was still hope in the world, even in a world torn apart by war. Days turned into weeks, and the prisoners were eventually loaded onto trains, their final destination unknown. But as they journeyed further into the heart of enemy territory, Heinrich carried with him a new understanding. The war would end one day, and when it did, perhaps it wouldn't be the battles they had fought that defined them. Perhaps it would be the moments like this, the quiet understanding between soldiers on opposite sides, when they realized that they were all just people caught in a war they never wanted to be part of. As the train rumbled on through the night, Heinrich closed his eyes, letting the hum of the wheels on the track lull him into a rare moment of peace. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. The war might have taken everything else from him, but it could never take that understanding away.